Canon Episode 3. How was the Bible canon formed? What was left out and why? Chapter 1. Opening. In the last session, we examined how the canon was recognized over time. We looked at process, we looked at authority, and we looked at the structures that were involved in identifying what was considered scripture. But now, we have to shift our focus because recognition is only one part of the process, and if that is where the discussion ends, then the understanding remains incomplete. Because there is another side to this conversation that is often overlooked. Not just how something was included, but how something was excluded. Because that question changes how everything is examined. Most people are taught to think about the canon as a fixed collection, a settled list, a completed structure, something that simply exists as it is. But when you begin to examine how that structure came together, you realize something quickly. It was not only built by inclusion, it was also shaped by removal, by separation, and by decisions that determined what would remain visible and what would not. Because that means what we have is not just a collection. It is the result of a process that involved recognition, selection, and distinction. And those decisions did not happen in isolation. They happened over time, across different communities, under different forms of authority, which means they were influenced by context, by structure, and by the systems in which they occurred. So if we are going to understand the canon clearly, we cannot only ask what is in it, we must also ask what is not, and who decided that. Because that question opens a different level of examination, not just of the texts, but of the process that shaped them. And that is where we are going in this session. Our Father blesses motion in obedience to His word. Shalom. Chapter 2. Foundation. Before we go further, we need to establish something clearly. Because if this foundation is not understood, everything that follows can be misinterpreted. Most people think about the canon as though it was decided in a single moment, as though there was one meeting, one table, one group of men, and one final decision that settled everything at once. But that is not how this developed. The canon was not formed in a single moment. It developed over time, across different regions, within different communities, and under different structures of authority, because that matters. These communities were not all the same. They did not all share the same history. They did not all share the same leadership. They did not all operate from the same framework for recognizing Scripture. Some operated within established religious systems. Others developed outside of those systems. Some preserved tradition through continuity. Others preserved writings through transmission, translation, and adaptation. Because this means canon history is not one straight line. It is layered, it is regional, it is communal, and it is shaped by the people and systems that carried the writings forward. Within each of these environments, decisions were being made, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, sometimes through councils, sometimes through practice, sometimes simply through what was copied, what was read, what was preserved, and what was passed down. Because not every act of canon formation looks like a council. Sometimes canon is shaped by what a community keeps using, what it keeps reading, what it keeps teaching, and what it stops carrying forward. That means the canon did not emerge from one single line of agreement. It developed through multiple lines of transmission, multiple communities, multiple frameworks, and multiple decisions over time. Because once you understand that, the conversation changes. You are no longer looking for one moment. you are looking at a process shaped by time, a process shaped by community, a process shaped by authority. And that process is what we are about to examine more closely. Chapter 3. What Scripture is. Before we go further into canon, we need to establish something foundational, because in many discussions about Scripture, this part is often overlooked. Scripture, before it is anything else, is writing. But not just writing in general, it is the writings of a people. And that distinction matters, because this is not detached information. This is not philosophy developed in isolation. This is not theory constructed from observation. These are records, accounts, testimonies of what was experienced, what was seen, what was heard, and what was lived. A record of a people, their history, their encounters, and their relationship with the Most High, which means these writings are not abstract. They are rooted in lived reality, in interaction, in response, in obedience, and in disobedience. And that changes how they should be understood. Because what gives these writings their weight is not simply their age, not simply their preservation, not simply their inclusion in a collection. It is the presence of the Most High within them, and how He regards what is written. That is what sets them apart. Not just that they were written, but what they represent, a relationship, an interaction between the Most High and a people. And when that is not understood, the conversation about canon becomes disconnected from the very thing that gives Scripture its meaning. Because now, the focus shifts from origin, purpose, and relationship to books, lists, and structure. And once that shift happens, Scripture is reduced to something it was never meant to be. A document to analyze instead of a record to understand. Which means, if we are going to examine the canon correctly, we must first understand what Scripture is. Not just text, but testimony. Not just writing, but record. Not just information, but interaction. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. We are not just examining texts. We are examining writings that were preserved, recognized, and transmitted because of what they represented. Because once you understand what Scripture is, you are now in a position to understand what was done with it. Chapter 3.5. Types of writings. Before we go further, there is something else we need to clarify. Because once we understand what Scripture is, we also need to understand how different writings have been categorized. Because not every writing was treated the same, and over time, certain categories began to emerge. Ways of describing how different texts were viewed, recognized, and handled. One category you may have heard of is the Apocrypha. These are writings that were preserved, read, and valued, but not accepted as Scripture in every tradition. Another category is what is called deuterocanonical. These are books that are accepted as Scripture in some traditions, but not in others, which means their status depends on which canon is being followed. And then there is another category, often called pseudepigrapha. These are writings that are attributed to earlier figures, but were written later, and because of that, they are generally not recognized as Scripture. Now this is important, because these categories are not just labels. They reflect how different communities made distinctions between what was accepted, what was useful, and what was set aside. Which means when we talk about what was included and what was not, we are not just talking about individual books. We are talking about categories of writings and how they were viewed. And that brings us back to the process, because once these distinctions began to take shape, decisions followed about what to preserve, what to emphasize, and what to exclude. And that is where we continue. Now, to make this clearer, let's look at a couple of examples. There are multiple writings connected to Ezra, what we often refer to as First Ezra, Second Ezra, and other related texts, and when you trace them back, they all connect to the same cultural origin, the same people, the same historical framework. But not all of those writings were treated the same. Some were preserved within the canon, while others were classified as apocryphal, which means the distinction was not simply about origin. It involved how those writings were recognized and how they were evaluated over time. Now consider another example. Books like Isaiah and Ezekiel. These are firmly within the canon, but when you examine their structure closely, you will find that they contain sections that reflect development across time, material that was preserved, compiled, and transmitted as part of the whole. And yet, they are received as canonical, not separated, not reclassified, but included, which shows us something important. The distinctions between these categories are not always based on a single factor, not just authorship, not just origin, not just content, but a combination of recognition, preservation, and how those writings were received within a community. And that brings us back to the process, because once you see that, you begin to understand that these categories are not always as simple as they are presented, and that is where the process continues. Chapter 4: Acceptance and Rejection. Now that we understand what Scripture is, we can begin to look more closely at how the canon developed. And this is where we need to make an important shift, because the canon was not only formed by what was accepted, it was also formed by what was rejected. Because most people are only taught to look in one direction, that certain writings were identified, recognized, and gathered together. But that is only part of the process, and if you only look at what was included, you miss what shaped the outcome. Because at the same time that some writings were being preserved, others were not recognized in the same way, not copied with the same consistency, not carried forward through the same channels. And that matters, because absence shapes outcome just as much as presence. Every time a boundary is drawn, two things happen. Something is brought in, and something is left out. And both of those actions shape what remains. Which means, canon is not simply a collection. It is a result of decisions. Decisions about what was considered authoritative, what aligned with belief, what was preserved, and what was set aside. And those decisions did not all happen in one place. They did not all happen at one time. They happen across communities, generations, and different structures of authority, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, sometimes through councils, sometimes through practice, sometimes through what was simply continued and what was not, which means what we now recognize as canon is a result of both inclusion and exclusion, not one without the other, both working together. And once you see that, you begin to understand something deeper. Canon was not only built by agreement, it was also shaped by difference, different perspectives, different frameworks, different conclusions about what should be recognized and what should not, which means the canon we now have is not just what was chosen, It is also what remained after many things were not. Pause there. And that is what we are about to examine next. Chapter 5. Canonization before the name. Now we take this one step further, because once you understand that canon was shaped by acceptance and rejection, you begin to see something that is often missed. Canonization did not begin when the word canon was used. It began much earlier, the moment a community recognized a writing as authoritative and treated it differently from other writings. Canonization was already taking place. The moment a text was preserved, copied, passed down, and protected, while other writings were not treated the same way, a boundary was being formed. And that boundary is what defines canon, which means canonization is not primarily a label. It is a pattern of distinction, a pattern of recognition, a pattern of separation between what is carried forward and what is not. Because this means canonization was not a single event. It was an ongoing process, a process that unfolded over time through decisions that were sometimes formal and sometimes informal, sometimes documented, and sometimes simply practiced. Because not every act of canonization looks like a council. Sometimes it looks like what continues to be copied, what continues to be read, what continues to be taught, and what quietly stops being carried forward. Key line: what a community continues to preserve reveals what it recognizes as authoritative. And every time a distinction was made between what is authoritative and what is not, canonization was taking place, even if it was never called that. And this is important because when people look back, they often search for a single moment, a single counsel, a single decision, but what they are actually seeing are points in a much longer process, moments where something that had already been developing was made more visible, more defined, more formal. Which means, to understand canonization clearly, you cannot start with the councils. You have to start with the process, the patterns of recognition, the patterns of preservation, and the patterns of distinction between writings. Key line: councils did not start canonization. They revealed what had already been forming, because that is where canonization begins. Chapter 6. Preservation and Power. Now we go deeper, because up to this point, we've been looking at the process, how writings were recognized, how boundaries were formed, and how canon developed over time. But now we have to examine something else. Not just who preserved the texts, who transmitted them, and how they were understood, but under what authority and under what system those decisions were allowed to stand. Because preservation does not happen in isolation. It does not happen outside of structure. It happens within systems, and those systems carry influence. Influence over what is preserved, what is copied, what is emphasized, and what continues forward. Because this is where the conversation begins to shift again. Preservation is not only a matter of care, it is also a matter of context. The context of authority, structure, and environment. And those elements affect outcomes, because the environment in which something is preserved will always influence how it is handled. Not always in obvious ways, but consistently. Which means, if we are going to understand how the canon developed, we cannot only look at the texts, we must also examine the systems that carried them, the structures that supported them, and the authority that allowed those structures to operate. Because once you include that layer, you begin to see something clearly. Preservation is not just a neutral act. It is something that takes place within influence. Key line. What is preserved is preserved within a system that has the power to sustain it. And once something is sustained, it continues, it spreads, it becomes established. And that is why this matters. Because now, we are no longer looking at preservation as a passive act. We are looking at it as something that occurs within a structure that carries influence. And that influence shapes outcomes. Keyline preservation does not just carry the message, it carries the system with it. And that is what we are about to examine next. Chapter 7, Systems and Empire. Now that we've established that preservation happens within systems, we can begin to look at the pattern those systems follow. Because when you step back and examine this across time, something begins to repeat, not in one place, not in one moment, but across different periods and different structures. You begin to see religious authority and governing power moving in alignment, not as the same thing, but as systems that interact, systems that influence each other, systems that operate within the same environment. And when that happens, decisions about belief, about doctrine, and about preservation are no longer happening in isolation. They are happening within a broader structure, a structure that values order, stability, and continuity, because systems seek to maintain themselves. And when influence overlaps, it begins to shape outcomes. Outcomes about what is emphasized, what is protected, what is reinforced, and what is allowed to continue. Because this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Across history, religious systems often exist alongside governing systems, not always controlled, not always identical, but connected enough that their influence overlaps. And that overlap matters. Because once you see that pattern, you begin to understand something important. Preservation is not only about keeping something intact, it is also about what is allowed to remain visible within the system, which means what continues forward is not only determined by what exists, but by what is supported. Keyline. When preservation meets power, neutral transmission becomes unlikely. Because that statement changes how you look at everything that follows. Now you are not only asking what was preserved, you are asking what was supported and why. And that is where this conversation connects to a larger framework. A framework where authority, narrative, and structure work together, and that is what we are about to name next. Chapter 8, Babylon Pattern. Now we need to name the pattern we've been seeing, because what we've described so far is not isolated. It is not limited to one time or one place. It appears across history in different forms within different systems. Religious authority and governing power, not identical, but interacting, influencing one another, operating within the same environment. And when that happens, belief, authority, and structure begin to move together. Because this is where the pattern becomes clear, a system where narrative is established, authority is reinforced, and structure is maintained, not always through direct control, but through alignment, through shared interests, through overlapping influence. Keyline. Where narrative and authority align with power, a system is formed. And within that system, what is recognized as truth often supports the stability of the structure, which means what is preserved, what is emphasized, and what is transmitted is not only about belief, it is also connected to the system that carries it. And this is what we refer to as the Babylon pattern, not limited to a single empire, not confined to one moment in time, but a recurring structure where authority, narrative, and power intersect. And once you recognize that pattern, you begin to see it in different places, in different periods, in different forms, but with the same structure. And that is why this matters, because now, when we examine the canon, we are not only looking at texts, we are looking at a process that has moved within systems, and that system has a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Chapter 9. Expanding the idea of canon. Now that we've identified the pattern, we need to widen the lens, because when most people hear the word canon, they think only of scripture, a specific collection of writings within a specific tradition. But at its core, canon is something more fundamental. It is a recognized body of authoritative material used to shape belief, understanding, and behavior. Because this is where the concept deepens. Canon is not simply a list. It is a structure that determines what is considered true, what is reinforced, what is taught, and what is passed down. And within that structure, there is always selection. Certain ideas are preserved, others are not. Certain writings are emphasized, others are set aside. And over time, those decisions become normalized, accepted, even assumed. Because canon does more than define what is included. It shapes how reality is understood. It creates a framework through which people interpret history, truth, authority, and meaning. And once that framework is established, it becomes the reference point, the standard, the measure against which everything else is evaluated. Because this is why canon has influence, not just because it exists, but because it is accepted, reinforced, taught across generations, and embedded within a system. Which means canon is not only theological, it is also functional. It functions within a society to stabilize belief, to reinforce structure, and to maintain continuity. Because once you understand canon in that way, you begin to see something important. This pattern is not limited to one tradition. It appears wherever a society establishes a shared understanding of truth, where certain ideas are preserved, reinforced, and transmitted, while others are not. And that brings us back to what we've already established: acceptance and rejection, recognition and exclusion, authority and transmission. These are not isolated actions. They are part of a larger pattern of how belief is structured and maintained. Which means, when we examine the biblical canon, we are not looking at something that exists in isolation. We are looking at something that fits within a broader pattern of how societies organize what they recognize as truth. Because once you see that, you are now in a position to understand the next layer clearly. Chapter 10. Ancient Parallels. Now that we've expanded our understanding of canon, we can begin to look at how this pattern appears in other contexts. Because what we've described is not limited to one tradition. It appears across different civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, we find collections of writings, preserved, recorded, and passed down, that describe origins, flood accounts, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. Among these are texts commonly referred to as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the tablets preserved in Nineveh. Now understand this clearly. These were not canon in the same way later religious traditions defined it. They were not assembled under the same structure. or recognized through the same process, but they functioned in a similar way. They provided a framework through which people understood reality, a shared narrative that shaped how people viewed the world, the divine, and their place within it. Because that is the connection. Not identical structure, but similar function. A body of material, recognized, preserved, and transmitted that influence belief and understanding. Keyline: where a society establishes a shared narrative of truth, a functional canon exists. And these narratives were not simply preserved for observation. They were connected to structure, to order, to governance. They reinforced how people understood authority, power, and stability, which means they were not just stories. They were part of a system where narrative, authority, and structure work together. And once that is understood, the pattern becomes clearer. Human societies have consistently formed bodies of authoritative material that shape belief, define understanding, and reinforce structure. So when we return to the biblical canon, we should not view it in isolation. We should recognize it within this broader pattern, not as something identical, but as something that exists within the same reality. That writings, when recognized as authoritative, shape how people understand truth and how they understand themselves. Because once you see that, you begin to understand the weight of what is preserved and what is not. Chapter 11: Authority and Governance. Now we take this one step further, because once you see that societies establish shared narratives of truth, you also begin to see what those narratives are connected to: authority. Because narratives do not exist in isolation, they are tied to structure. They influence how people understand what is right, what is acceptable, what is true, and what is not. And over time, those understandings become embedded, reinforced, passed down, until they are no longer questioned, but assumed. And when that happens, those narratives begin to support something larger: order, structure, governance, because how a people understand truth directly affects how they function, how they respond to authority, how they organize themselves, and how they maintain stability. Which means, recognized writings do more than inform. They shape behavior, they influence decisions, and they establish a shared framework for how a society operates. And this brings us back to the connection we've been building. Narrative, authority, and structure are not separate. They are linked. And when they operate together, they form a system where what is recognized as truth supports how the structure functions. Because this is where the pattern becomes clearer. When a narrative is established and accepted across a people, it becomes part of how that system maintains itself, not only spiritually, but socially and structurally. Key line: what a people accepts as truth will shape how they live under authority. Which means, when we examine what is preserved, what is emphasized, and what is transmitted, we are also examining what supports the structure that carries it. And theaeth is why this matters. That is where the connection becomes undeniable, because now we are not just looking at texts, we are looking at influence, framework, and function, and how those elements work together over time. Chapter 12: Language and Transmission. Now we move into another layer: language. Because as these writings moved across time, they also moved across languages, from Hebrew to Greek to Latin, and eventually into other languages. And in that process, changes occurred, not in the sense of rewriting the entire message, but in how it was expressed, how it was heard, and how it was understood. Names were rendered into different forms, pronunciations shifted, structures adapted to fit the language they were being translated into, because language is not simply a tool. It carries meaning, it carries context, and when something moves from one language to another, that context does not always transfer in the same way, which means translation is not just conversion, it is interpretation, because every translation involves choices about which words to use, which meanings to emphasize, and how to represent what was originally written. And those choices are not made in isolation. They are made within tradition, structure, and authority, which means as these writings move through different languages, they were also moving through different frameworks of understanding. And that affects how they are received, how they are taught, and how they are understood. Key line: translation involves choices, and those choices shape understanding. Because once you see that, you begin to understand why this layer matters, not because language destroys meaning, but because it influences how that meaning is carried forward. And that influence is part of the larger process we've been examining. Chapter 13, Cultural Framing. Now we take this one step further, because once something has been translated, it still has to be presented, taught, explained, and understood by the people receiving it. And that is where another layer comes in: culture. Because as these writings moved into different regions, they were not only translated, they were framed through teaching, imagery, and presentation in ways that aligned with the culture they were being introduced into. Over time, as these writings were presented in different cultures, the imagery, the setting, and the way people visualized what they were reading began to reflect the environment they were in. Because presentation influences perception, and perception shapes understanding. Because this matters, people do not encounter information in isolation. They encounter it through context, through what is familiar, through what they already understand. Which means Scripture was often presented in a way that people could recognize, a way that made sense within their environment. And over time, that framing becomes normal, it becomes expected, and eventually, it becomes assumed without being questioned. Which means what people think they are seeing is not always the original setting, but the version that has been presented to them through culture, through teaching, through repetition. And this does not necessarily happen in one deliberate moment. It develops over time, as teachings are repeated, as images are reproduced, and as interpretations are passed down, until the framing itself becomes part of how the message is understood. Key line: people do not just receive the message, they receive the frame that carries it. And once the frame is accepted, it influences how everything is interpreted, what stands out, what is emphasized, and what is overlooked, which means cultural framing becomes part of the process of transmission, not separate from it, but integrated into it. And that is why this layer matters. Because now, we are not just looking at what was written, we are looking at how it was seen. Chapter 14, Power and Expansion. Now we take all of this and look at it on a larger scale, because these writings, these translations, and these frameworks did not remain in one place. They spread across regions, across cultures, across nations. And as they spread, they did not move alone. They moved alongside language, institutions, and systems of authority. Because throughout history, there have been periods of expansion where influence extended beyond its original boundaries. And when that happens, what is carried outward reflects the structure it came from. Which means, as these writings moved into new environments, they were not only received, they were introduced through systems. Systems that taught them, systems that interpreted them, systems that established how they should be understood. And over time, those systems became the reference point, the authority structure through which people encountered Scripture, not the original environment, but the transmitted one. Which means the spread of Scripture was also the spread of interpretation, the spread of framework, the spread of structure, and that matters because now we are not only dealing with what was written, but how it was introduced, how it was taught, and how it was established in different regions. Key line: what spreads with the message shapes how the message is received. And once that structure is established, it becomes the lens through which everything is understood, which means, over time, people are not just receiving Scripture, they are receiving a system, a framework, and a way of understanding that has already been shaped. And this brings us back to the pattern, because now we can see clearly that preservation, translation, framing, and expansion are not separate processes. They are connected, working together over time to shape how Scripture is encountered and understood. And that is why this matters, because now we are in a position to ask a deeper question. Chapter 15: Control and Access. Historical example. Now we bring this into focus with a clear example, because everything we've discussed, preservation, translation, framing, and expansion, can feel abstract if it is not grounded. So let's look at something historically documented. An example often referred to as the Slave Bible. This was a version of Scripture used in a specific historical context, where portions of the text were intentionally omitted. Sections that spoke of deliverance, freedom, and resistance were removed, while other sections were retained. And this was not accidental. It was done to shape how the text would be understood, to influence what would be seen and what would not, to guide interpretation in a specific direction. Because this illustrates something clearly. When access is controlled, understanding is influenced, not because the text itself has no meaning, but because the portions that are visible shape the conclusions that are reached. Which means control does not always require rewriting everything. Sometimes it operates through selection, omission, and emphasis. What is included, what is excluded, and what is repeated. And when that happens, the framework of understanding begins to shift, not necessarily through force, but through limitation, through what is available to be seen. And once that framework is established, it influences how everything within it is interpreted. Which brings us back to what we've been building. Preservation, translation, framing, and expansion all operate within systems. And those systems have influence over how the message is received. Key line: when access is limited, understanding is directed. And this is why this example matters, because it makes visible what can otherwise remain unseen, that the handling of Scripture is not only about preservation, but about how it is presented and what is allowed to be understood. Chapter 16: Councils and Formalization. Now we return to something many people are familiar with: councils. Because when people think about how the canon was established, they often look to specific moments, gatherings, meetings, and decisions that appear to define what Scripture is. One of the most well-known is the Council of Nicaea, and it is often associated with the formation of Christian doctrine. But we need to understand this clearly. These councils did not begin the canon. They did not create scripture. What they did was formalize what had already been developing. They brought structure to beliefs that were already present. They clarified positions that were already being debated, and they defined boundaries that communities had already begun to recognize. And this did not happen in isolation. These councils operated within systems, within established institutions, within environments where authority and structure were already in place, which means their decisions carried weight, not only spiritually, but institutionally. And as time moved forward, different traditions continued to develop. Catholic structures, Anglican developments, Protestant reformations, each interacting with Scripture differently, each emphasizing different aspects, each operating within its own framework of authority. And even within those traditions, there were distinctions. High church structures, more formal, more institutional. Low church movements, more decentralized, more interpretive. Different approaches to the same texts. Which means what we now see is not the result of one single decision, but the outcome of multiple processes across different systems over time. Key line. Councils did not create the canon. They formalized what communities had already recognized. And that brings us back to the pattern, because now we can see clearly that structure, authority, and recognition have been working together throughout this process, and that is what shapes what we now have. Chapter 17. Internal differences. Even within these systems, there are differences. Not all structures approach Scripture the same way. Some traditions operate within highly structured systems, formal, institutional, ordered in how they teach, how they interpret, and how they present Scripture, often referred to as high church. Others operate with less formal structure, more decentralized, more interpretive, allowing for a wider range of expression and understanding, often referred to as low church. Different structures, different approaches, but the same texts. And this matters because it shows that even when the writings remain consistent, the framework surrounding them can differ. How they are taught, how they are explained, and how they are applied, which means understanding is not shaped by the text alone. It is also shaped by the structure through which the text is presented. Key line. The same text within different structures can produce different understandings. And that brings us back to the pattern, because now we can see clearly that structure, framework, and interpretation continue to operate together, even within the same body of writings. Chapter 18. Core integration. Now let's bring this together, because we've covered a lot of ground, and each layer has been building towards something. We began with the canon, how it was recognized, how it was formed, but what we've actually seen is something deeper. Canon was not a single decision. It was a process shaped by acceptance and rejection, recognition and exclusion. And we saw that this process did not happen in isolation. It happened within systems of authority, structure, and transmission. We saw that language matters. That translation involves choices. That meaning is carried, but also shaped as it moves across time. We saw that cultural framing matters. That people do not only receive what is written, they receive how it is presented. We saw that expansion matters. That as Scripture spread, It moved through systems that introduced it within structured frameworks. And we saw something clearly through example, that when access is controlled, understanding is influenced. So now, we have to include one more layer. Authority. Not just spiritual authority, but institutional authority, because at different points in this process, decisions about what was preserved, what was formalized, and what was emphasized were recognized and reinforced within structured environments where religious authority and governing power operated in proximity, not always identical, not always unified, but close enough that their influence overlapped. And when influence overlaps, it begins to shape outcomes about what is maintained, what is elevated, and what continues forward, which means the development of the canon did not happen in a vacuum. It happened within environments where structure mattered, where stability mattered, where continuity mattered, and within those environments, what was recognized as authoritative also had to function within the system that carried it. Key line. Canon was not only preserved, it was preserved within systems that had the power to sustain it. And once something is sustained by a system, it becomes established, reinforced, passed down, and eventually assumed, which means to understand the canon clearly, you must look beyond the text. You must examine the process, the systems, and the authority structures that allowed it to become what it is. Because once you see that, you are ready for the next question. Chapter 19. The final question. Now we arrive at the question all of this leads to. Because after everything we've examined, the process, the systems, the structures, the transmission, there is still something that remains. A deeper question. Not just what is Scripture, but how should it be understood? Because up to this point, we've been looking at the external side, how the writings were handled, how they were preserved, how they were transmitted across time. But none of that guarantees understanding. A person can read Scripture, study Scripture, memorize Scripture, and even quote Scripture, and still not understand it. Because quoting is not the same as comprehension. Repetition is not the same as revelation, and familiarity is not the same as understanding. Because now, the question begins to shift from the text to the person reading it and how they approach it. Because not everyone approaches Scripture the same way. Some approach it as a subject, something to study, to analyze, to interpret from a distance, and there is value in study. But study alone has a limit. There is another way Scripture is approached, not just as a text, but as something closer, something personal, something that is read not only for information, but with recognition. Because there is a difference between reading about a people and reading in a way that recognizes what is being read. The way a person reads history is different from how they read about their own family. When something is personal, you do not just analyze it. And this goes even deeper, because when something is connected to you, your posture changes. There is a level of attention, a level of care, and a level of submission that is different from distant observation. Familial connection does not approach something casually. It leans into it. It searches it. It holds it with weight. And that affects how the message is received. Because when there is a deeper connection, there is also a deeper submission to what is being said. And that allows the message to penetrate more deeply. Not just to be heard, but to be received. Key line. What you are connected to, you submit to differently, and that changes everything. You look for yourself in it. You look for patterns, connections, continuity, and that changes how you receive it. Key line. Distance produces analysis. Relationship produces recognition. And this is where many stop, at analysis, at study, at information, without realizing that Scripture is not only meant to be examined, it is meant to be understood. And that understanding is not produced by effort alone, not by study alone, not by memorization alone. It must be opened, and that changes everything, because now the question is not just, what does this say? But am I in a position to understand it? And that is the transition from text to understanding, from structure to discernment. And that is where we go next. Chapter 20. The Disciples' Problem. Even perfect text does not guarantee understanding. Now we move from principle to example, because everything we've said about understanding, about posture, about approach, is not theoretical. It is shown clearly in Scripture. The disciples walked with him. They heard the teachings. They saw the works. They witnessed the miracles. They were present for the explanations. And yet, they still did not understand. Over and over again, they are corrected, questioned, challenged. Do you not understand? How is it that you do not understand? Because this is important. They were not outsiders. They were not distant observers. They were as close as anyone could be. And still, they lacked understanding. Which means proximity alone is not enough. Exposure alone is not enough. Hearing is not enough. Even seeing is not enough. Because something was still missing. Not information. Not access. Understanding. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because now we can see clearly that understanding is not produced by experience alone, not even by direct exposure. It is something that must be given. And until that happens, a person can be surrounded by truth and still not see it. And this is not limited to the disciples. We see the same pattern in another account, a ruler reading the Scriptures, actively reading, engaged with the text, and yet, when he is approached, he is asked a question, "Understandest thou what thou readest?" And his response is direct, "How can I? Except some man should guide me." Because this reveals something clearly. He had the text, he was reading it, but he did not yet have understanding. Not because the words were not there, but because the meaning had not been open to him. Which means reading alone is not enough. Access alone is not enough. There must be understanding. Chapter 21. Understanding opened. And this is where everything changes. Because after all the questions, after all the confusion, after all the moments where understanding was missing, something happens. A moment that shifts everything. It is written, "Then opened he their understanding, that they might understand the Scriptures." This is the turning point. Not more teaching, not more explanation, not more exposure. Understanding was opened. Which means it was not something they produced on their own. It was not something they reached through study. It was not something they arrived at through effort. It was given. And that changes how we understand everything that came before. Because now we can see clearly why the disciples struggled, why the ruler did not understand, why access was not enough. Because understanding is not automatic, it must be opened. Key line: understanding is not achieved, it is revealed, and once it is opened, everything changes. The same words now carry meaning, the same teachings now become clear. What was once confusing now makes sense. And this is the difference between reading and understanding, between hearing and perceiving, between knowing and seeing. And this is where the entire conversation now shifts. Because if understanding must be opened, then the next question is clear. What opens it? And that is where we go next. Chapter 22. Final close. Now we bring this to a close. Because everything we've examined, the canon, the process, the systems, the structures, has led us here to a realization that changes everything. The issue was never just the text. It was never just what was preserved, what was transmitted, or what was included. The issue is understanding, because a person can have access to Scripture and still not understand it. They can read it, study it, quote it, and still miss what it is saying. And we have seen this clearly. The disciples walked with him and still did not understand. The ruler read the text and still did not understand until something happened. Understanding was opened. And that is the key. Not just access, not just exposure, not just study, understanding. Because once understanding is open, everything changes. The same words carry different weight. The same passages become clear. The same message is no longer distant, but alive. And that is where this leads. Because if understanding must be opened, then the question becomes, what opens it? And that is where we go next. Remember, brothers and sisters, our Father blesses motion and obedience to His word. Shalom.